The first time I saw Darwin, I thought, how could anybody live here? What kind of antisocial person would possibly want to live here? And it turned out that I guess I was sort of antisocial too, and I just really caught on right away that it was not a bad idea to be comfortable with solitude.
This is the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, 30-minute conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 164. Find out more about the podcast at desertladydiaries.com or engage with guests, listeners, and me on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries. Kathy Goss has been living in the remote high desert community of Darwin, California since 1997. During the preceding 3+ decades in the San Francisco Bay Area, she was an active contributor to the poetry and music scenes and eked out a livelihood as a ghostwriter, collaborator, and author of books on alternative medicine, renewable energy, consciousness studies, and other tools of liberation. Her fictional memoir, Darwin Diaries, recounts the peculiarities of life in her adopted desert home, where she continues to write, make art and music, and promote local well-being. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me here.
This is an exciting
seat of your car.
I know, it's an exciting adventure. Kathy was generous enough to meet me halfway because Darwin is pretty far in Northern California, so we're literally in my car in a parking lot of the Home Depot in Ridgecrest, California. And it's awesome. It's so much fun. So what was your first experience with desert?
Well, I grew up on the East Coast, and of course there was no desert there. And then I came out to California to graduate school at Berkeley. And so the first time I actually saw the desert was traveling in Mexico, taking the bus from Tijuana down to colonial mountain towns. And so the desert was this huge expanse of nothing you just had to get through, usually at night. I remember the first time I actually got out of the bus in the desert was at the customs check at Sonoita coming down from Tijuana, and there in the parking lot under the glare of the parking lot lights at night was this huge dead tarantula.
Oh.
It took many years for me to realize that tarantulas are really cute, cuddly little critters, but at that time that sort of exemplified my feelings about the desert. But driving through the desert at that time, you'd be going on and on and on through the dark, and there would be a few silhouettes of cactus or something. And then all of a sudden there would be a string of lights off in the distance, like a necklace draped over the horizon. And you'd approach, and it would be a little town just stuck out there in the desert, lit up at night. You'd drive through the town, and the streets were all sort of narrow and few livestock still running around, and there would be these pots of flames, like smoky fire. I don't know what they were for because there was electricity in these towns. And then you'd leave again, you'd go back out into the darkness and away from that string of lights. And little did I know, many years afterwards, I was going to be living in one of those strings of lights out there in the desert. And then I started backpacking in the Sierra, and sometimes with friends I was traveling with, we'd go up over the passes from the west side to the top of the Sierra, and you'd look out toward the east, and you'd see this pale expanse of nothing, sometimes with distant mountains. So again, it was the desert was like a really alien presence. And eventually I started hiking in the desert too, and I became more familiar with it and realized how fascinating and complex it really was.
So at what point did you decide you were going to actually move to the desert, and how did you decide on Darwin?
Well, I didn't decide any of that. I was living in San Francisco. I'd been there for about more than 30 years. And at this particular time, I was living in a flat that I shared with a gay Argentine friend on Potrero Hill. And I had already been introduced to Darwin through a series of circumstances that are too complicated to go into, but I had met a lot of the people who lived in this tiny little town. The first time I went to Darwin, actually, I was looking for a poet friend of mine had told me about named Hal Newell, who was the son of a famous sculptor, Gordon Newell, who also lived in Darwin. But I hadn't been able to reach Hal on the phone when I went and looked for him when I happened to be in the desert anyway. So I just drove, turned off where the sign said Darwin, drove to up this lonely looking road up to the top of a pass. You get over the pass and you look out, and the whole little bowl below you is surrounded by mountains. And there's that string of lights again. And I drove into town. Well, it wasn't a string of lights because it was daytime, but you could tell it was a string of lights. Past this broken down looking mine with all these little miners' shacks, and then entered the town itself, which consisted of broken down buildings and broken down vehicles. And I had the distinct feeling that there were eyes looking at me from behind the curtains of these broken down buildings, which actually turned out probably to be true. And I got to the stop sign, which was the only stop in town, and realized I didn't really want to get out and walk around since I couldn't locate this Hal guy, and I turned around and drove back out. So over the years I met Hal outside of Darwin, back in Big Sur actually, and he started to show me around the desert and introduced me to people who lived in Darwin, who turned out to be a pretty interesting cast of characters. And then I thought, wow, he keeps telling me how cheap everything is here, how you can buy property for practically nothing and all these broken down houses. Maybe I can get one for a vacation home. So Hal, over time, started introducing me to people who might be interested in selling their houses because I didn't live there full time. And nobody really wanted to, but a few people offered to let me stay at their places when I was in Darwin if they weren't there. So my brother and his wife came out from Missouri to visit me, and we went camping at Saline Valley Hot Springs and came back to the place that we were staying in Darwin. And I checked my answering machine in San Francisco, and it was full of messages. And most of them were friends of mine sounding really worried, saying, well, call me before you do anything. And there, buried in these messages, was a call from the San Francisco homicide inspectors, detectives, saying, your roommate has been murdered, we want to talk to you right away. So it turned out that what happened was my dear friend Juan, who was very closeted, had picked up a young man in a bar in San Francisco, brought him back to our place. I didn't know he was doing this. And they had gotten into an altercation. Juan had run into my bathroom, and the whole place, mainly my bathroom, but a lot of the rest of the flat was a bloody crime scene.
Oh my gosh.
So there I was, and I really couldn't do much about it right away. They did find the guy who was responsible, and so that was a long, dragged-out drama. But meanwhile, I had to live in this place and go about my business because I had some writing projects until I could find another alternative. Meanwhile, I was still sort of hoping I could get a vacation home in Darwin. Meanwhile, I was on a waiting list for a live-work place in one of the converted factories in the industrial district in San Francisco, which was quite the thing at that time for cheap housing in the city. So I was sort of unable to proceed with my work, which consisted of working on editing a book for a wonderful woman named Virginia Goldstein, who was working on a book about mess painting, which is a therapeutic painting process in which you throw paint around and yell and scream and emote and laugh and cry and sing and dance all by yourself, doing 2-minute paintings on folded out Wall Street journals because they were the largest newspapers you could get. And so it turned out that the next thing on our agenda while we worked on the book was for me to take her class with a bunch of other people. And the theory is that mess painting can change your life, especially for people who are feeling some kind of creative block. So I set up my mess painting studio in what had been Juan's office in the flat, because I was still there. And I spent that spring and summer turning out 1,000 of these 2-minute paintings and yelling and screaming and jumping up and down and emoting and getting paint all over me and all over everything else. And by the end of that, I really felt like I'd gotten a lot off my chest. But right then, I get a call from Hal in Darwin saying there are a couple of houses for sale and did I want to come and look. So I jumped in my car and drove out to Darwin and looked at the places. And one of them, well, it was a little sketchy, was okay to move right in and turn it into my vacation home while I waited for my live workspace. But the live workspace never materialized because it was just the beginning of the dot-com boom, and all the rich techies were buying all this stuff up to have expensive lofts. And so there I was in Darwin with my second string of furniture and trying to work a little bit there while I waited this out. This was in January of 97. I was finally completely moved in there, waiting it out. And then, of course, I never got to go anywhere else. So there I was in Darwin wondering, well, I wonder what the spring's going to be like. And it turned out to be beautiful. And I thought, what's the summer going to be like? And it was hot. It was like 117 on my porch. And I was working on a 1,000-page manuscript at that time that I was ghostwriting about alternative medicine. But I managed to survive that. And then fall came. And that was wonderful. And then I realized I must really be living there. So that's how I ended up in Darwin.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So you did know someone there when you moved.
Yes.
But
yes.
then how did you start meeting other people?
Well,
and how many people were there at the time
At
you
that time,
moved?
the accepted number was 40.
Okay.
About 40. And so Hal made, he immediately started introducing me to other people there because he was one of the centers of what passed for a social scene there. So I got to know people, and then I got to know the people who didn't want to sell me their houses. And then, of course, right away I got involved in trying to do a little creating of culture there. About 6 months after I moved into my place, a friend of mine from Saline Valley Hot Springs bought the place catty corner from my place, and we decided to have a mutual housewarming for a spring party. And so that began the tradition of the Springama Jig, which got named that a couple of years later. And it was a crazy, wild, wonderful, exuberant, joyful party with a Saturday night dance and a theme every year. And you were supposed to have costumes that fit the theme. And we had things like maypole dances if it happened to fall on the 1st of May. We had Cinco de Mayo one year, which was really crazy. And we discovered pretty fast that you had to keep the numbers down at this thing because a lot of people heard about it and wanted to come. And so it became an invitation-only event. We tried to keep it to about 150 people for a 3-day weekend. And it went on for about 20 years. And then at that point, I was getting a little tired of doing it, so I sort of passed the baton to a couple of my neighbors, and then the pandemic hit, and we couldn't continue at that point, so it's been in suspension for 2 years now.
Wow.
And then the other thing I did to help contribute to the culture of the community was I had a band in the Bay Area with a partner who's now deceased, and the band was called High Strangeness. We did spoken word and original weird music and played in weird places in San Francisco. So when I moved to Darwin, he helped set up a recording studio in a cargo container, and we renamed ourselves Hostile Elders and continued to make recordings there. And then we got the idea it would be fun to bring a bunch of our musician friends to Darwin for a long weekend and just improvise together. And
Is that the music camp?
that was the music camp.
Okay.
And so that became a 14 or 15-year tradition before we had to stop that one. So I sort of developed a reputation as somebody who was constantly coming up with big events that were going to attract a lot of people. And there's always like a little undercurrent of resistance to these kinds of changes in Darwin.
Sure.
In my book, Darwin Diaries, I have 2 Greek choruses that comment on things that people do, and the newcomers who come to town, they're always going, who does she think she is? Think she can change things? Yeah, she'll see, she'll find out. And as a matter of fact, the culture did evolve, and either the people who were grumbling died or moved away because they couldn't get good medical care in Darwin, or we became the grumblers,
Right. Well, and it's funny you should mention the medical care, because even where I am now in Joshua Tree, I think about that sort of thing. What are some other things? Because the closest town to Darwin is how far away?
It's 40 miles away, and
Right.
that's Lone Pine,
Oh, okay.
which
So that's his
is a
groceries.
tourist community, of course, because it's the
Right.
gateway to Mount Whitney and the Pacific Crest Trail, which has suddenly become extremely popular. And at the other end, it's the gateway to Death Valley. And so there's a lot of high prices in Lone Pine because of that. And there's a small hospital there, but it can't really accommodate anything serious. They barely have a bed to put you in if you come in with an emergency, and generally they send people up to Bishop, which has a larger hospital.
And what about fire, police?
There is no such thing in Darwin. We have no government of any kind. There are
Except
no,
like the water board.
well, yeah. There's no police. There's no government. There's no churches. There's no school at this point. Although there have been schools in the past when the mine was operating, and there were a lot of kids who were going to school there.
And the population was much higher.
Oh yeah, when Darwin was a boom town, there were an estimated 3,000 or 4,000 people living there. And it dwindled down as the mine became less active, and then the mine finally closed in the late 70s. There's a guy now who owns the mine and is doing a lot of promotion to raise a lot of money, but I'm not sure what his plan is other than mining investors for investments. But it could become a busy place again, which would certainly change the whole
Complexion.
atmosphere of the town.
Yeah, totally. Besides the doctors and the grocery store 40 miles away and the hospital 40 miles away, what other things make it hard to live there in particular, or in the desert?
Okay, well,
would you
first
say?
of all, you can't get stuff, whether you go to Lone Pine or not. If you're working on a building project or you're trying to fix your toilet, you think you know what part you need, you drive to Lone Pine and you discover you've gotten the wrong part, and then you have to drive back to Lone Pine and get the right part. So people do a lot of scavenging, which is one reason for all those old broken down vehicles around town. They become a source of parts. Same with building houses. Again, people have to go way out of their way to get materials to work on building. And so a lot of materials are recycled from the old falling down buildings. And as a matter of fact, there has been an exception written to the Inyo County building and zoning codes allowing for outhouses and recycled materials to be used in construction in Darwin. It's called the Darwin Specific Code. And I think the only people who know it, Darwin Specific Plan, and I think the only people who know about it anymore are a few of us in Darwin. I mean, I have a copy of it, but every now and then we have to wave it in front of the planning department or the Board of Supervisors and remind them that this is indeed still in force.
Wow.
And they better not mess with us.
I love that. What were some pleasant surprises when you moved to Darwin?
Well, the first time I saw Darwin, I thought, how could anybody live here? What kind of antisocial person would possibly want to live here? And it turned out that I guess I was sort of antisocial too, and I just really caught on right away that it was not a bad idea to be comfortable with solitude and your own projects. And so that was very pleasant. Getting to know the burros who come through town was one of my special surprises because I've become very fond of them. Some people in town don't like them because they poop all over the place and they eat the trees. And there's been a big roundup recently in Darwin. Once again,
really?
they've been collecting them to take them to a sanctuary.
Is it the one down by Death Valley?
No, this is in
okay.
Texas. There's a
Oh.
group in Texas now that is apparently is doing a really good job. And they got a contract with, I guess, with the entire Department of the Interior to do wild horse and burro roundup. And they've been coming through for a few months now
Oh, wow.
collecting. They used to use helicopters a lot, which is very traumatic for the animals.
Yeah.
But I think they may be doing water trapping out on China Lake Base now. We are right adjacent to the base. So that's another pleasant surprise, actually. I mean, despite all of the war stuff going on there and the occasional bomb going off that you can see blowing up the desert, our water source is out there, which creates a few problems, but we do have access to our water line with a key to get through the gate. But also, the Navy has protected a huge expanse of desert environment because it's a military base. And so except for the occasional bomb crater, it's well protected. The burros are very happy out there. The plants are in much better shape than they are out in the desert in general, where people are riding around in their off-road vehicles. So it's like a symbiotic relationship that we have with the base that they're really preserving. And of course the petroglyphs in the Cosos, which are on the Navy base, are the largest collection of petroglyphs probably in the United States.
Holy cow.
And you'll see here in Ridgecrest, as you drive through, a lot of petroglyph imagery because they're trying to turn it into a tourist thing now.
Oh, I see. Well, I was wondering when I drove into town, I was actually pretty surprised at the number of hotels that were here. And I think I said to you, wow, this is a lot bigger place than I expected it to be.
Yeah. I think it's partly because a lot of military contractors come through here.
Gotcha. Okay.
Scientists, mostly.
So besides the writing, are you still doing your pastel work and your recycled art?
Yes, and now that has evolved because as soon as the pandemic lockdown started, I realized I didn't have a thing to say. I didn't have a note to play. I was just stunned by the weirdness of the whole situation, and I decided the first thing I had to do was to make a totem to protect the town. So I went with my partner, who's here part of the time and part of the time he's in New Mexico, and we went and got a couple of down Joshua tree trunks and sawed them off and brought them back, and then I looked at them and I realized, no, they're too hard to cut and they don't stand up, so I'm going to look for something else. So I made a totem out of some old junk metal and put him or her, I'm not sure which it is, in the window of the schoolhouse, which is on my property, an old dead schoolhouse, looking out at the road that comes into town to protect the town. And so far, so good. Nobody in town has gotten infected.
Wow, that's amazing.
Nobody who lives there full time. And it's a very vulnerable community because there are a lot of old people who live there. And then I made a couple of other protective things out of other kinds of junk. And then I started painting. And as I listened to the President's Coronavirus Task Force daily briefings and got madder and madder, I would paint something about what was going on with the pandemic, what the government was or wasn't doing, how people were reacting. And I did a series of 15 poster-sized, cartoonish paintings depicting the progress of the pandemic. It was really pretty good, and as I finished each one, I would put it in the window of our community building across the street from me. And then finally, after about 15 months of that, I arranged to have a show, which I did in Tacoma, the beginning of this month, actually. And in preparation for that, over this past summer, I made a book that was a collection of all these paintings, plus poems that were written either during the times that I was working on the paintings or sometime that was still during the pandemic, which is now. We're still in the pandemic. So I published that as Coping with COVID. And that's like my Darwin Diaries. Both of those are available on Amazon and probably nowhere else because they're both self-published. And,
there you go.
Yeah. And so that was how I got it off my chest, and I discovered that I had a new way of expressing myself on a slightly larger scale than I had been accustomed to. And they're really fun and really funny in the midst of something that's not funny at all.
Right. Can people find them on your website?
Yes, the links to both of those books are on my website,
Which is?
KathyGoss.com.
Great. And I will put that in the blog for the show notes. And back to your writing, you actually brought some things to read today. And if you do go to Kathy's website, I highly encourage you to listen to her Old Girl's Home. She actually reads it. It's in audio on the website, so check that out for sure, KathyGoss.com.
You might want to listen to Dial-Up Girl, too, because when you called me originally, I told you, I can't do Zoom where I live. I can barely get online.
Right, exactly.
And so that's a pretty funny one, too. This poem is about the wild burros in Darwin and environs, and I actually wrote it while I was still living in San Francisco based on what I had been told about them.
Oh, interesting.
But it sort of conveys a lot of the feelings I have about them. Wild burro poetry. You know their voices declaiming appetite and third world hunger. But have you seen the trails they weave in the desert? Nothing straight. Crab, defiant text, scribbled among creosote bush. Their gentle gaze turned inward, thoughts elsewhere than on the walking. The new gate across the spring, a new way needed through the government fence. The trails meander and converge on water. Monstrously horny, weighed down by enormous erections when the females are in season. Terrible rutting wars, hooves clashing in the night, flat ungulate teeth rending flesh. The victor wins the harem, the loser banished to wander loopy trails behind the herd, living on leavings. Progeny of an abandoned race, left to fend for themselves when no longer considered useful, they choose survival out of narrow, bloodless desert leaves. They are tough enough to be perfect companions for Jesus.
Thank you for doing that. You are splitting time
Yes,
between Darwin and near Taos.
right. When I'm in Taos, my brother and his wife and I have bought a even more primitive place than in Darwin, off the grid, collecting water on the roof, solar. We bought it from a guy who had actually built it with scrap materials and lived there for 14 years before he sold it to us. Another cheap deal. And fortunately, he used a lot of adobe since that was there on the ground. And so it's pretty well insulated against the heat of the summer and the cold of the winter, but it gets cold there in the winter. But I spend about 3 months there every summer, and it's sort of like being on a monastic retreat because I have to be hauling water in buckets. And when I get back to Darwin in September, I think, wow, I just turn on this tap and usually water comes out. And sometimes it looks a little funky, but at least it comes out.
Right.
And there's real electricity, but I really like that solar out there. It's on a sagebrush mesa, which I guess also passes as high desert. I think there's some controversy about whether you can call something that high up desert.
Oh, gotcha.
Because it's at about 7,200 feet.
That's pretty high.
And you can see the mountains, an unobstructed view of the mountains across the Rio Grande Gorge. And then there's town on the other side of the gorge, swarming with tourists.
Right. That must be beautiful.
But I have some very dear friends there, which is part of the reason I got that place. I have some literary friends there who I really appreciate being able to spend time with, who are getting really on in years. And so it's very valuable to me to be able to go out there and spend some time with them.
I think that's the one thing I think about, one of the things I think about the most about living in the desert as I age. And all of those things about like the doctors and access and how far do I have to drive, that sort of thing. That's really on my mind.
Right. Well, Darwin is really a case of aging in place for the people who live there, and except for the few who really do need more extreme medical care, or a couple who become too demented to be able to be taken care of in their homes. It's a great place to die. I have a chapter in Darwin Diaries called Dying to be Buried in Darwin. And it tells about a few people who even wanted to be buried there, although they never lived there. And the people in town, who do they think they are? They can't bury their father there,
Wow. Well, yeah, I guess there's a feeling of living there has its own, badge of honor.
Right.
And really, if you're going to be buried here, you need to put in the work, as it were, right?
But I've done some work editing books about co-housing for the people who brought co-housing to the United States from Denmark. And in a way, Darwin is like an unintentional co-housing community because we all sort of ended up there. I think everybody who lives there now has introduced at least one other resident to the town.
Oh, interesting.
So we're sort of sculpting our own community there.
Right. Well, and I was wondering about that because you said it took a while for you to even get the opportunity to buy your property.
Right, yeah.
So
yeah, usually there's nothing available, but people have been getting old faster for some reason recently, and so we had a big series of deaths over the last couple of years that peaked during the pandemic, but right before, actually. So there were a few houses that were actually available, and it became apparent that things weren't going to be that cheap anymore, and there was sort of a feeding frenzy of people wanting to move there because we've gotten a reputation for being paradise.
Yeah. Well,
or not.
Right. Well, and if you're more curious about Darwin, you can actually find a documentary. It's on YouTube.
Yeah, there are a couple of documentaries.
Are there? Okay.
Yes.
So the one I watched was by Nick
Brandestini, who's
Right.
Swiss, and he has a pretty good resume. Unfortunately, the people who live in Darwin don't think it's a really fair representation of the
Oh.
community, because he settled on some of the freakier aspects of the community. Not that it's not freaky anyway, but I think he missed a lot of the creative spirit that prevailed even when he did that documentary, which was a number of years ago now. There's a French woman named Anne Verdonier who came and did a documentary full length sometime just shortly after that. I think it's called Darwin Somewhere in the Desert or something like that. And she was much pushier, and her cameraman was really obnoxious and French, and I didn't want them to have anything to do with me, but she did a much more sensitive job of finding the people who had something to say about their creative process.
I was wondering as I watched, I mean, you can't really, that's not a kind of place that you just march in and say, hey, I'm doing this, who's in?
Right.
So did they go through a process
Nick
of...
contacted me. For a long time, I was the go-to person for everybody who wanted to horn in on the community and sort of the screen. And Nick seemed like a nice guy, so I said, okay, well, I'll introduce you to a few people. And a couple of people really glommed onto him and took him around and showed him where Charlie Manson lived in the desert, and I knew Charlie in prison. I'm thinking, oh, God,
Yeah, because the title of that particular documentary...
No services ahead, yeah. So I thought, what have I done? And we didn't really know how unrepresentative it was until Nick finally did a showing of the documentary in Darwin.
Oh, okay.
And people left looking like, what was he thinking?
Aww.
Because he's European, and I think the problem is that Europeans have a very stereotyped view about what it's like to live in the desert, and if you don't appeal to that stereotype, people might not think it's real.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
And he couldn't quite get any other handle on it. He thought maybe the thing about the scarcity of water there, maybe that would work. And then it turned out he got taken onto the Navy base to be shown our water line, which of course was completely forbidden to have an outsider allowed on the base, especially a foreigner.
Sure, yeah. Because even in 29, you're at the gate, you've got to show ID and all this
we have
other
our
business.
key to the back gate.
Oh.
So that could have gotten us in a lot of trouble. He did some shooting on the base.
Oh, my goodness.
I hope nobody from China Lake is listening to this.
Well, I want to thank you so much for making the trip and sharing all of this information about Darwin. It's fascinating to me, and I hope at some point that I'll be able to make the entire trip when I have more time and really have those eyes peering out at me. Because, I think somebody in the documentary said something about if you're coming into town, it's not like nobody knows you're here.
That's right.
So before I let you go, I would love for you to choose 2 little chips out of the jar for the Diary Unlocked segment. If you're listening for the first time, this is where I'm going to ask Kathy 4 random questions that she just pulled out of my little bingo chip mustard jar, because we're fancy.
Right.
This is big time entertainment. And if you're interested in hearing Kathy's answers to these questions, just go out to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support tab, and learn how you can support the podcast either through a one-time donation or signing up to become a patron of the podcast. As a patron of the podcast, you will get to hear Kathy's answers to these questions. So the questions I'm going to ask Kathy are, what's your favorite fairy tale or childhood book? What's one of the scariest things you've ever done? What is something that was better back then than it is now? What is something people would be surprised to learn about you? So again, if you want to hear Kathy's answers to those questions, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support tab, and sign up to become a patron of the podcast. Kathy Goss at kathygoss.com. Check out all her work there. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing about Darwin.
Thank you.
I have a shout out this week to Patty N. Patty, thank you so much for signing up for the new episode newsletter. If you don't want to miss an episode of Desert Lady Diaries, sign up for the new episode newsletter at desertladydiaries.com. Thanks so much for listening.